Some stories are sad, and some are scary, but this story is about bravery. Two friends, two owls, and how they overcame their fears. Actually, this isn't just a story, no, it's a tale. Yes, the tale of Herbert and Hoot. And what a tale it is. Let's start at the beginning, when Herbert and Hoot were just two little owls perched up in their tree. Since they were little, Herbert and Hoot have been best friends. They did everything together. They learned to fly together, went to school together, played together, and even endured the weather together. Yes, they were inseparable. Herbert was the idea owl, and Hoot, well, he was just Hoot. He tagged along. The two were an odd pair, Herbert the quiet thinker type, and Hoot the loud playful type. They did have one thing in common, though. Neither owl was much of the adventurous thrill-seeker type. No, Herbert and Hoot liked the plain, no-excitement kind of fun. You see, owls aren't bold, not like eagles and hawks. They don't like to soar and hunt. Owls like to perch and watch the time go by. They might play hide-and-seek in the summer and chase leaves in the fall, make snowmen in the winter and pick flowers in the spring. But they definitely don't like scary adventures. An owl's life is pretty simple. However, one night that changed for Herbert and Hoot. On this night, their simple lives changed forever. They were in the old farmer's barn, a place where they spent much of their time, when they heard a noise neither one had heard before, a noise that shook Herbert's feathers. "What was that?" Herbert whispered, his voice rattling with fear. "A birthday cake," Hoot said excitedly. This was a typical Hoot response. "Quiet yourself, Hoot. What if what made that noise heard you? And why would a birthday cake make that kind of noise?" Herbert asked. Hoot in his softest voice answered him. "Maybe there was a birthday party." "Nobody has a birthday party at this time of night," Herbert argued. "Whatever it was, anything that makes such a big noise must be, well, big. And if it's big enough to make that monstrous sound, it must be scary." Herbert paused. This was all happening too quick. Suddenly there was the sound again. Herbert shuddered. He cleared his throat. He didn't want to say what he thought it was. "What?" Hoot asked with reservation in his voice. "A wickelwarp." Herbert shook his head as the word slipped from his beak. Neither of them had ever seen a wickelwarp, but they had heard stories at school. This dreadful creature, they were told, had two great big horns on its back and sharp claws on its feet, and a love of Swiss cheese. But the real danger was its razor-sharp teeth, which were lined with a venom so potent that just by stepping in its drool would make you sleep for a week. But why would a wickelwarp be here? What would it want from their simple little world? Just then they heard the strange sound again, this time shaking the feathers on both owls. "Do you think it's coming after us?" Hoot cried. "I hope not. But we should hide here, though, until morning, just in case. Wickelwarps don't attack during the day," Herbert replied. "I wish it was a birthday cake," Hoot sighed. There they sat all night, hearing the terrifying new noise breaking the silence every few minutes. Just when they'd think it was gone, there it was. Herbert and Hoot felt like the sun rose slower than ever that morning. And just as the story said, once the sun was up, the scary sound stopped. The wickelwarp was gone. With the sun to keep them safe, the two owls slept and temporarily forgot their troubles. But when they awoke, they remembered the night before and began to talk about what to do about their wickelwarp problem. "No one knows what to do about a wickelwarp because no one's ever lived to tell of such an encounter," Herbert explained. "Right now, we just need to find a safe place. The safest place in the whole wide world to stay tonight in case the wickelwarp comes back." Hoot took his time with his thoughts, but coming up puzzled, he asked, "A safe place? Like a box? Or a shell? How do we get inside a shell?" No, not a box or a shell. More like a cave, or, Herbert realized there was a serious lack of places safe enough to hide from wickelwarps. He was becoming worried, but off they went anyway. Soon it would be dark. Soon they'd be in danger of the wickelwarp. They flew far and wide, trying out any place that looked like a possible safe house. Herbert tried a nice deep hole, but then wondered what would happen if the wickelwarp jumped in with them. They would be devoured for sure. That wouldn't do. Hoot tried to disguise himself as a tree, but that didn't quite work either. Finally, they ended up back in the old barn. The barn had a window they could watch from, and an old dim light that glowed faintly all night long. As long as the wickelwarp hadn't picked up their scent there the night before, they'd be okay. If he had smelled them, well, they didn't want to think about what would happen then. By this point, there was no other option, so they set up for a long night. The sun began to sink behind the ocean of fields, and the distant trees looked like little boats on the horizon. Within minutes, the sky was dark, and the first stars were popping out. Herbert and Hoot sat in silence, fearfully crossing their feathers and hoping they wouldn't hear that dreadful sound. "I never thought we'd have to hide from a wickelwarp, Hoot," Herbert said, breaking the silence. "I wish I had a snack," said Hoot, who was always hungry, even in the direst of situations. As soon as Hoot's words came out, their conversation was interrupted by the sound they didn't want to hear. "The wickelwarp!" Herbert shrieked. He must have said it too loud because they heard a rustling sound from the bushes. Herbert couldn't get his mind off the thought of the wickelwarp's razor-sharp teeth. Out of nowhere, the old farmer's porch light came on. The front door of the old farmhouse flew open, and the old farmer ran out, flashlight in hand. The old farmer didn't like owls, and Herbert was sure he didn't like wickelwarps even more. There was a mess of panic. "Fly!" they screamed. The farmer shined his light on Herbert and Hoot as they flew frantically away, smashing into rocks, trees, and a fence. They ruined the farmer's shrubbery and nearly collided in the process, but they got away. As they sat perched on the highest branch in the tallest tree, catching their breath from a panic-fueled flight, Herbert hoped wickelwarps couldn't climb trees. He also noticed something. "Do you hear that?" he gasped. "Popping corns?" Hoot guessed. "No, I think the farmer scared away the wickelwarp." "Oh," Hoot said dreamily. He had already forgotten what they were talking about and started to daydream about trees made of Pop-Tarts. Though they didn't hear the wickelwarp any more, they stayed up the rest of the night, wide-eyed, jumping at any sound the dark night made. Herbert knew they couldn't do this every night, and the wickelwarp was going to keep coming back until it had caught them. 2 nights of hiding was taking its toll on them. Herbert knew a more permanent solution was needed. "We can't do this every night," he said. "Eat snacks?" Again, Hoot forgot what was happening. "We need to get rid of the wickelwarp. Surely it will return until it has devoured us. We need to catch it." "And then what?" Hoot asked, hoping the answer would involve food. "We mail it. Somewhere far away." Herbert wasn't sure how he was going to mail a wickelwarp, but hey, the planning process was still young, and he's still trying to figure out the catching it part. "Oh, I love mail." Hoot was excited. The rest of the night, Herbert brainstormed about how to catch a creature he had never seen before. He knew they didn't like light and thought he remembered someone at school saying wickelwarps like Swiss cheese, though maybe that was something Hoot told him. Herbert knew the trap would have to be big, maybe a deep hole covered in leaves. But how would he get the wickelwarp out? Maybe a net hooked to a pulley to hoist the wickelwarp up from under itself. No, that wouldn't work. Wait! He had it. Once the sun finally peeked over the hills and it was safe, Herbert got started drawing up plans and then started building his trap while Hoot took a little snooze.